Hello and welcome to day 79. We are going to be working through Joshua chapter 7 and 8, Psalm 69, and 1 Corinthians chapter 5 today. So I find it interesting, this theme from both Moses and Joshua of talking to God, arguing, debating with God, trying to change God's mind on taking a certain action, using the argument, take care of us or your reputation is going to be damaged. Moses used this in Egypt. Moses used this while they were in the wilderness. Joshua is now using this. What will the neighbors think of your power, God, if you let us fail, if we don't come through, if we're not successful? Now, in my context, I find it hard to believe that this is a winning argument with the creator of the universe. But back then, I have to imagine that there was major competition. Just about every people had a different God that they worshiped, that they believed was all powerful. Some of them had many gods and a whole collection of gods to pray to for different needs in their lives. Today, it seems like there are fewer options. You either believe or you don't believe, or you don't even care enough to believe or not believe. You just don't think God exists. You don't think God is relevant, that God is involved in our lives. It just doesn't matter. You don't see how God brings anything to anyone's life. So I think it's really interesting thinking about this argument. I don't know that it's a very compelling argument to our ears these days, and I don't know how compelling an argument it was for God. But in this case, God points out it's not really God's decision that things aren't going well with the loss at the city-state of Ai, but rather that someone in Israel has been disobedient, has not followed the rules, took stuff from Jericho, which was supposed to be first fruits, it was supposed to be left for God, and there are consequences for our actions. Now, as we read this, I don't think the point is a tit for tat judgment. You do this, so I'm going to do this. I think here the point is that God wants a committed and loyal relationship between us and God. God has made a commitment to us. God wants us to make a commitment to God. God wants us to live out that commitment in our lives. Now, the story of the conquest of Ai ends successfully once they figure out what's going on, and Joshua comes up with a great battle strategy. They win, and it ends with Joshua showing his own faithfulness to God. He reads from the Revelation or the Song of Moses, which is at the end of Deuteronomy. Just a quick note here, depending which translation you're reading, some of them says he read from the Revelation. This is not the Revelation of John that's at the end of the New Testament. Obviously, that hasn't been written yet. We're talking about the revelation of the Song of Moses that was at the end of Deuteronomy that we read, a week or so ago. And it has a whole listing of the basics of God's instructions to us, also some blessings and some curses. So that's what they're talking about here. So those of us who are Christian and are more familiar with the New Testament, we often have our minds jump to the revelation at the end of the New Testament that we are more familiar with. But here we're talking about the reading from Deuteronomy. Looking at chapter 69, this is one of the classic Psalms that is a cry for help. It is a deep personal description of personal woe. It's also a pretty harsh call for retribution against the perceived enemies of this person. And to be honest, that part's a little hard to read sometimes. The person goes pretty in depth as to what they'd like to see happen to their enemies. But it does end with some great statements about how God is great. It's a great worship and praise piece. They say that they're going to tell the world, and they clearly believe that God is going to prevail in the end. This is another great one to bookmark for when you're having a really terrible time. But, always remember that with all the Psalms, everything in the Bible was written by someone for someone at a particular place and time. So while a lot of these things have timeless truth and a lot of them are very useful for us, it's okay to feel like you're uncomfortable with some of the sections of this psalm, and just, let God know how you feel about those sections. But I think it is a beautiful psalm about trust and faith in God and hope that God will come through in the end. Going on to the 5th chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, I don't want to get into the details of the particular sin here. What I want us to think about, because we all have our own sins, we all have our own ways that we fall short and wander off from the pathway that God has set before us. What I'd really like for us to focus on today is this idea of yeast. Now, if you're making bread, if you've ever made bread from scratch, you know there's a small amount of yeast. It's a tablespoon, maybe 2 tablespoons that go into a batch of bread. It is not a lot of yeast. I mean, you often have 4, 5, 6 cups of flour, some other ingredients, and then just 1 or 2 tablespoons of yeast. But that small amount of yeast is what makes all of the bread rise. It permeates every section of the bread. And this is the image that Paul wants us to have, that when we wander off, when we turn towards sin and away from the instructions God has given us for living lives of justice and mercy and holiness, then sin is like yeast. It permeates everything in our lives. So Paul is advocating that as a family of believers, we need to address problems as they arise quickly and directly before they fester and grow. The other interesting thing here is, which is something that I think Christians have struggled with for many generations, for many centuries, is that Paul is not calling us to separate completely from the world. He's like, it's not that you can never speak to a prostitute, never speak to a thief, never speak to someone who's corrupt. Paul wants us to be in the world, but not of the world, meaning he wants us to have relationships with people so we can show God's holiness in our lives and encourage other people to change their lives. So we aren't supposed to stray from God's plan. We need to live holy lives, but we show holiness to others through our choices and through our behaviors. And I think this is something that people have really struggled with. And I think this is, for our reflection today, I think this is a big part of the debate that is happening in the United States right now. How far do we go implementing certain laws that conform with a certain interpretation of Christianity or another faith, that then force other people to adhere to that same interpretation? This is really where our debates over marriage and abortion and LGBTQ rights come from. There are different interpretations within Christianity. There are different interpretations among different religions. How far do we go as a democratic, tolerant, diverse, pluralistic society where we have welcomed many people of many different faith traditions within Christianity, many other faith traditions? How far do we go in setting up laws that conform with one set of traditions but are in violation of other traditions? And this is a borderline that has been a debate of U.S. life going back to the writing of the Constitution. You know, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of to worship the religion that you wish to worship, and the separation of church and state. Those weren't in the original Constitution. They were added in the Bill of Rights. This has been a long debate that we are still struggling with, and I think it's one that we have to be very careful with, that we spend more time living our own lives in the way that we want others to see Jesus in us, rather than necessarily going through politics to force our our religious interpretations onto the political scene. So this is a really tough debate that we're facing right now. And I think what Paul says is it's important to live in unity. It is important to live with love and compassion for each other. And at the end of the day, each of us is going to be judged on our own decisions, not on the decisions of the people around us. So mull that over today, and we will see you next time.